Our first speaker is Yossi Shavit. Since I haven't prepared, I only remember that her biography is so long that I felt so ashamed. I had one line there, and Yossi had all the prizes, okay, so Yossi, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Reuven, for inviting me to speak here. I'm truly very excited by this fusion of economists and sociologists. I was just chatting to Mayor just before, and we both said the same thing. Finally, the economists discovered our agenda. And then he said, and now they're going to take it over. So, those of you who are sociologists, I need to figure out how to make this work. No? Somebody needs to help me. Those of you who are sociologists will recognize this picture which I keep showing whenever I talk about this issue. One of the strands of research that I've been involved in for some 25 years has been the matter of change in educational inequality of opportunity. And in the early 90s, there was a group of us headed by Rob Mayer, whose picture is on the top of the right-hand side. And then you see me, that's how I looked once, and a few other people. And we thought we stumbled across a finding, which is that what we now call educational mobility, intergenerational educational mobility, is relatively stable over time in most countries. And this held on for a while, and we got many citations for this, and we got promoted. And then about 15 years later, the bad guys came. These are the people on the left. And they challenged our finding, and they keep doing so. And you see pictures are added as the two camps increase in size. And today is Yossi's last stand. This is the last time I'm ever going to defend my position on this. And what is the position? The position is that change over time in inequality of educational opportunity is stable over time in relative terms, in positional terms. Now, Miles, I think, raised the issue of positionality in your discussion, namely the need to study mobility in relative terms rather than in just absolute terms. I think it was you, was it? No, somebody. And this links to that same agenda. So, what I intend to do is study change over time in inequality of educational opportunity in Israel, and then report on a study that I'm involved with others. And I'm going to do so comparing three types of measures of education: a nominal measure, which is real terms; a positional measure, which is relative terms; and thanks to Tom DePreet, I'm also going to compare educational mobility in terms of returns to education. Tom and I once spent a day in Petra, and we had a conversation about this, and that was about the time when I started working on all of this. And he said, why don't you also measure education in terms of what it's worth? So I'm going to do that as well. My co-authors to these various papers that I'm going to summarize only two. I was planning to do more, but Asaf Rotman, who is sitting over here, Michael Shalev, who is not here, Herman van der Werfhorst, who is the only person who appears twice on the program. He's also a co-author of Tom's. Tony Tam and Hunjun Park. Okay. Now the results, in case I don't get to the very end, this is what we find. In nominal terms, inequality of educational opportunity, which is, in sociology is what economists refer to as intergenerational educational mobility, immobility, is either stable or declines depending on where you go. But in relative terms, in positional terms, it tends to be either stable or to increase depending on where you go. So the positional perspective on this issue yields a much less optimistic outcome than the nominal perspective. So just to clarify the concepts, inequality of educational opportunity, as I said, is equivalent to intergenerational education immobility, and it's defined as the association between parents and offspring's education, or in that Galton equation it's defined as the, what do you call it in economics? The elasticity. I have a degree in economics, by the way, but I forgot all of that. What is a positional good? A positional good is said to be, a good is said to be positional, I'm quoting from Hirsch, if its relative value is negatively determined by its use or by its ownership by others. So honor, not everybody can have honor, not everybody can have power, and our friend Wout Ulte even says that cars are positional because the more people on the highways, the less useful a car is because of traffic jams. Okay, this is the starting point, the educational expansion in Israel. Similar patterns appear in many other countries, not in all, not so much in the US anymore, but in other countries education expands, and governments expand education for all sorts of reasons. They want to enhance human capital, but they also want to enable the lower classes to attain more education. So they bring up the floor. So for example, compulsory education is being increased in order to artificially force people up the ladder, except that the ladder runs away from them. So there are two perspectives on this issue. One is that expansion is an equalizer, namely that it draws from the lower classes. And the other general perspective is that expansion perpetuates inequality of educational opportunity, and under this umbrella there are four major ideas that I'd like to repeat because not everybody is a sociologist here. One is called the MMI hypothesis, maximally maintained inequality, associated with the names of Raftery and Hout, and the basic idea here is simple. Education expands. This is where education expands, okay? So at first it expands, and the upper classes or the affluent classes make better use of the expansion because they are poised to exploit it more effectively. So inequality of educational opportunity increases at first until the affluent classes reach a saturation point where they can't avail themselves of any more, say, matriculation exams because they're at about 100%. And then any further expansion reduces inequality of educational opportunity, except by then that credential is not worth much. So this is model number one. A sequel to that model is called EMI, associated with Lucas. And the point here is this: expansion is always accompanied by differentiation. So for example, the Israeli system of higher education expanded, but was differentiated into colleges and universities. And stratification, which is an outcome of expansion, then contributes to the persistence of inequality because the upper classes know what's what and are insistent on their kids taking the high road rather than the low road. And then there is Sigal Alon's much cited paper, which says essentially the following: that expansion entails two things. At the micro level, at the family levels, it entails uh, family strategies that are aimed at keeping their kids ahead of the flock. Whereas at the collective action level, it entails getting institutions, elite institutions, to put in place more stringent selective criteria. Sigal, is that a fair summary? Good. So you can see how that too leads to the perpetuation of inequality. So, okay, I will not summarize because I'm losing time. Now, most of the research that has been done on educational stratification in sociology, and I dare say in other disciplines as well, with several exceptions, assumed that educational categories are comparable over time. So, for example, we would compare the elasticity vis-a-vis, say, a matriculation diploma in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, assuming that a matriculation diploma is a matriculation diploma is a matriculation diploma. But since the matriculation diploma is not the same as it was, and any mother will tell you, Bagrut כבר לא מספיק, then in fact we are comparing apples and oranges. So the significance of educational categories change, and they change because of positionality, because they are no longer as scarce as they had been, or because of credential inflation. Asaf, thank you for this suggestion. The two concepts are related, or because of technological change, which was discussed previously and need not be repeated. Just to illustrate this point, take a look at these two curves for 1995 and 2008. They represent the occupational SEI. SEI is what think of prestige scales of occupations. So these are the prestige scores of occupations that people with different levels of schooling, primary, secondary, etc., got on average between these two time points, and you can see how education, the value of higher education, post-secondary education, fell over time. And if I were to show you a graph for income, it would have been the opposite. Higher education entails much higher relative earnings today than it had before. So education means different things at different time points. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to think of education as a positional good. Namely, we are going to think of education think of deciles or whatever, but not exactly. Now, this is not a new idea. Signaling theory thinks of education in relative terms. And Lester Thoreau, I know economists don't like Lester Thoreau, but we do. And Oa Sorensen did. And a new student, he's also on the program twice. He's also on your paper. Thijs Bol. Yeah. So these people are, and then we came along 20 years later, and we are trying to do the same thing. Namely, think of education as a positional good. There's a very nice piece by Bol and Verhofstadt, which shows that with educational expansion, the value of education vis-a-vis the labor market is increasingly positional. In other words, the more education expands, the less it is valued for its intrinsic, let's say, human capital value, and more for its relative significance, which could be debated, but it's in the literature. I love this quote. I love John Goldthorpe. I love this quote. So John Goldthorpe came up with the idea very similar to what Tom suggested to me in Petra, which is if I were to look at education in terms of the returns to education rather than in terms of absolute categories of education, then this finding that inequality of educational opportunity declines, that's the opposition, remember, that finding would go away. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do three things. I'm going to look at change between cohorts in IEO, in nominal terms, positional terms, and in terms of the returns to education. And I'm going to skip this theory part, and I'm going to summarize essentially not that paper is gone, this one and this one. The first paper appeared last year in a journal edited by Meir Yaish called RSSM, Research in Social Stratification and Mobility. There was a special issue which I edited with Hunjun Park. And I'm going to summarize a paper which is still in progress that I'm writing with Herman and Tony and Hunjun. And this is, if you are interested in the other papers in the special issue, they are listed here, and with one exception, the findings for UK, for Japan, where else? And for the Netherlands, are similar to the Israeli data that I'm about to show you. But we are not going to get into that. So here is the first paper. Israeli-born respondents to the 1995 and 2008 censuses. Clear so far? In the age groups 30 to 34, presumably after they finished schooling, but are already in the labor market. So they are born in the years 61 to 65 and 74 to 78, admittedly a very short time interval. You might think that because the time interval is so short, I wouldn't find change either way, but I do. So respondents' records were merged with their parents' record in the preceding census. So for example, the 2008 records were merged with parents' records in 95, and the 95 records were merged with records in 83 census. So we have this quasi-panel data. Here are the sample sizes. This is the structure of Israeli schooling. For those of you who are not familiar, skip it. Just to underscore what Momi showed us before, namely the increase in inequality in the Gini coefficient among families during the period where these cohorts were growing up. So economic inequality was higher in the second cohort. Now, to the extent that the Gatsby curve is true, then the greater inequality of opportunity, right? No? He's not saying anything. At you? Both of you, actually. Okay, the variables. We measure respondents' and parents' education on ordinal scales. We are also measuring respondents' years of education. We are converting the ordinal measures into what we call PSI. I'll say a word on that in a second. Parents' income is measured in the previous census in fixed shekels adjusted for household size, gender, and ethnicity. Now, PSI is a measure developed by Tony Tan, which is essentially the log of the ratio of the proportion below a credential relative to the proportion above the credential. So for example, if a credential is attained by 80% of the cohort, then it would be the log of 80 divided by 20. Is that an exact definition, Asaf? Yeah, okay. So it's a measure that's very akin to percentiles, but it's got some advantages that I don't want to get into now. Here is the distribution of education by year. You can see that between 2008 and 1995, the proportion with BA in Israel increased considerably among the cohort of respondents at the expense of the very low levels of education. But it also increased, I apologize, the Y scales are not scaled to the same scale, I apologize. This is the parents. We often ignore the fact that parents also shift to the right of the distribution. So you can see that parents started off concentrated below secondary schooling, but the parents of the second cohort are doing better educationally than the parents of the previous cohort. The economic returns to credentials are measured as a recode to the mean earnings of 30 to 34-year-old workers who worked full-time in fixed shekels for each educational category. So basically it's what is this qualification worth income-wise. Okay, and here I'm sure you can't see anything, so I show you a reduced version of the table. And basically what it is you've got, these are logit regressions. The logit regression of secondary plus education, matriculation plus education, MA plus education, and BA plus education, and MA plus education, then an OLS regression of years of education. And here you have an interval regression of the log PSI, intervalling the top and the bottom boundaries of each category. Think of this as sort of an expanded logit. And here you have an OLS of the income worth of qualifications. And what do we see? We'd like to concentrate on this line over here. This is the coefficient for the interaction coefficient involving parents' education and period. So you've got parents' education. This is the effects of parents' education in the second of the two time periods, the 2008 group. And if equality of educational opportunity were to decline, this would have been negative and significant, or at least one of these would have been negative and significant, and none are. So in Israel, in nominal terms, there was no change between 95 and 208 in inequality of educational opportunity or intergenerational educational mobility, but in positional terms, namely, I can't see what I'm doing here. In positional terms, there was an increase in inequality of educational opportunity or a reduction in mobility. And when cast in terms of the income value of credentials, the same story holds true. So the first conclusion is that in what I just said, stability in nominal terms and declining mobility in relative terms, as well as in returns to education. And these are results that are consistent with the theoretical part that I skipped over. Now this is the other paper.
When you measure in money values, you measure also the dependent variable.
I measure the dependent variable of education is the dependent the money value of education is the dependent variable. But now that you asked, it occurred to me that I forgot to mention that in that equation, in the relative equation, the right-hand side equations, parents' education is also transformed into relative terms and okay. So moving on to the other paper, this paper is about 35 countries, not just one. And again, my colleagues are listed here. Here's some information on the data. Essentially, we are using European Social Survey data for these years with add-on from the US General Social Survey, the Korean equivalent, and the Taiwanese equivalent, just to increase the sample size of countries. Education is defined in nominal or ordinal terms as these categories. Again, same design, more or less. And again, I'm going to show you, I'm going to skip over this, okay. Please take a look at the two circles here. They show the exploratory results in nominal terms and in positional terms. The nominal terms, these are predicted values by parents' education. Each line represents parents' education. And the x-axis represents cohorts. And the y-axis represents predicted value as if education is not ordinal but is rather interval, so from 1 to 5. And you can see the reduced inequality between categories of parents' education. You see the convergence. And this is the finding that the so-called opposition, remember, they report in repeated studies. They show us that the lower, I call them the lower classes or the lower strata, are converging towards the top. Not much is happening in the upper strata of education. They are relatively stable, these lines. But the bottom is converging towards the top, which is great news, except that look at this. In positional terms, now the y-axis is that log PSI, and again, parents' education in relative terms, we chopped it up into 5 segments, and what you see here is a whole different story. Now I can show you, of course, the parametric version of this. For men, I can show you the parametric version of women. Same story. Again, the design of the table is the same, except the results are that in the 35 countries on average, in nominal terms, there was not stability in mobility as we saw for Israel, rather there is an improvement. There is an increase in mobility because the association is lower now. Except that in relative terms, take your pick, there's no change whatsoever. And the same goes for women. So to summarize, how am I doing on time? So the international study, this one, shows a substantial increase in mobility between nominal educational categories, as we saw, due to the upward mobility from the bottom of the educational hierarchy. No trend in intergenerational mobility between positional educational categories, as we saw. And no trend in mobility when education is scaled to occupational scores. I did forget to mention that whereas in the Israeli case we scaled them to income, now we scale them to occupational prestige scores, but it's equivalent. Tom always teaches us that SEI is the lifetime earnings. Is that what you call it? No? You're not helping me, Tom. Okay, continue. Now, in Israel, mind you, the results are less optimistic. In nominal terms, there was no educational mobility, unlike the average of the 35 countries. And in relative terms, there was a significant decline in educational mobility. So we can talk about policy implications, but maybe we leave that for the discussion and discussants. What we intend to do now, hopefully, is to introduce qualitative distinctions to education. For example, vocational versus academic secondary education. We intend to explore further the institutional and contextual factors that affect positionality of education, that is, in which countries is education more or less positional by inequality of income, scope of vocational education, and other things. And what we'd like to do is to extend the Israeli case further beyond the 95-2008 time bounds to see how it may have developed over a longer period of time. Thank you.
I was asked to discuss this paper, and I want to talk on uncertainty. Uncertainty was not mentioned today. If you look at what happens, people, when they go to school, they don't really know what they're good for. Now you hear me? When people start going to school, they are not sure what they are. being able to do, how good they are. And so they have to sometimes to try to do two things at a time. They learn, as I did, economics and philosophy together, just to be sure. But basically, you just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty. Because of this uncertainty, people also run into what's called cycles. If you look at the data, there are large cycles in Israel in terms of people going into computer science and in terms of going to law. So in these areas, there was a huge increase into those places. Then there was a huge decline following it. What will be next, I don't know. I just want to say that just looking at all these graphs and describing what happened is not enough. So we need some kind of model to understand what people are doing. And this is difficult, and I don't think, I've not done it yet. Okay, that's it.
Comments and questions? Robert, please. I've tried to translate Yossi Shavit's paper into economics. Now these are two different languages, and the translation is not always easy. So I don't know what the PSI means, but I'll study PSI language, and then I have another question. But I try to think about the second measure which you used. The second measure takes schooling and multiplies it by the average wage of this schooling group or this diploma group. So essentially, what you are doing is running an income elasticity, with the only difference being that instead of taking individual income, you take average income. So essentially, you drop the residual. Now, what bothers me is that if I translate it to my language, this in a way shows that for once, when you take the average income, you show a reduction in mobility. Is that right? Or a reduction in mobility. And if you would have used, and since you use the average and not the true income, there is also the classical error of variables bias. So the reduction should have been even sharper. So that may be true or not, but that's definitely in our language something that we have to think about when we hear the other papers on income mobility.
Yeah, thank you. Very much enjoyed that presentation. I'm one of the few policymakers in the room. And my comment could have been made on any paper today, and I think it's beware the tyranny of averages. And as a policymaker, we're interested in the non-linearities, the bits at the ends of the spectrum. And I think my one question, and I asked this to John Goldthorpe as well, by the way, we have these debates in England, I would argue that the most important thing in English education is which education you do. So to treat, as far as I understood it in the paper, as all schools being the same, certainly in an English context would be nonsensical. So which school you attend has a huge impact on your outcomes, and indeed which university course, and that is becoming increasingly the case. So I wasn't sure when you look at these results, they seem to be so big, the categories. I was wondering how valid they are, because there is so much variation within them. It's just a question.
First, I have to apologize for making too many comments, but since I don't present any paper, at least this is my humble way to contribute. I want to warn all of us of any measurement of mobility in the following sense. If an economy is in a steady state, then when we measure mobility or correlations across generations in education, for example, then we get some good idea of what really is there in a sense of the individual chances of an individual to move from one class to the other or from one category to the other. But we are not in a steady state in terms of education. I mean, if you look at the raw data, for example, in the Barrow-Lee dataset, the amount of education, maybe not in the States, because there the process ended something like 10, 15 years ago, but in most other countries, the percentage of education is increasing significantly, especially of higher education. So clearly, when we have an increase in the number of people with high education, a large percent of them came from parents who did not have high education. We know it when we teach our students, especially I'm teaching also in Italy, and I teach a lot of students who come from the South, who are the first generation of education. So in that case, you get a measurement that shows you high levels of mobility, but it can be misleading, because maybe there's not a lot of mobility, but as the expansion of public education brings more and more people to complete a high degree of education without previous education in the dynasty, that can give us an impression of high mobility while it's not. It's part of a more broad macroeconomic process of reaching some higher goals in education attainment. So we have to be careful with the interpretation of these results.
I have a reasonably simple comment, but one which may have implications for the results, which is that once you start evaluating education in terms of the return to education, there's both the return and the variance around that risk, and even in a formal sense, if you like have a log normal distribution, then it's the level plus half the variance, and this may have an impact on our perception of the extent to which there is persistence and not if once you make these transformations.
Yes.
Let me just respond then, Tom, because I forget. I don't have a note.
Microphone.
Okay, Tom. Can I respond and then? With respect to, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah, I fully agree with your comment, and in fact, in the last slide I said that we are about to, hopefully, somebody is about to bring in qualitative differences between schools, between fields of study, apropos a lecture which will be given later on, and there is a whole industry of people who are trying to do this. With respect to Yossi, I fully agree. Yossi, the whole point is that what I said is relevant because of this phenomenon that you're talking about. Lower class or low education families in times of educational expansion satisfies for that little extra that the expansion process offers them. It's the upper classes, it's those who are at the top of the distribution who understand the trick, who understand that they must stay ahead of the pack, which is that theory part that I skipped over. So I fully agree that education cannot be taken in its face value in times of rapid educational change. And what was the last? Yeah, and I fully agree with that too. We would not have presented that column of results in alone, as a standalone, but just to show that the results are identical to the results that we obtain when measuring education in PSI or relative terms, and they just support one another.
Okay, one more short question and we'll move to the next.
This is partly a response maybe to Ruben and Marcus, and maybe also Marcus. But I mean, I think education isn't like money in the sense that it doesn't have a natural metric. And when we say, well, let's use years of education, I mean, that's like a theoretical imposition on the reality. And, you know, we all know that, like, in the American system, the 16th year is worth more than the 15th year because it's a college degree. And so we do nonlinear models, we do logistic regressions. And, you know, many people think that an Ivy League education is worth more than a state university education. And so, again, it's not like, oh, 16 is equal to 16. So it all gets to the question of how you scale it. But there's, you know, there's always some kind of scale. So I don't think it's a matter of like what happened to the error. It's a question of what is the appropriate scale for the purpose at hand.
Okay, thank you very much. We move to
I just want to add that when I talk about uncertainty, it's not so simple because you have to deal with a big market where different people are doing different things and you don't know what they're going to do. So if they do something A, you go to school as well. If they do something B, you don't go to school. So again, I think that uncertainty is extremely important in these problems.